The crew mocked a black passenger by offering him a parachute jump. But when they found out who he really was, they realized they had made a fatal mistake. What happened next? Subscribe and share where you're watching from. Harry Davis adjusted his jacket as he stood in line, blending in with the steady flow of passengers moving through the bustling airport terminal. His steps were unhurried, deliberate, yet his mind was far from idle. The decision to fly anonymously had been a calculated one, a chance to see his airline's operations firsthand, without the veneer of titles or expectations. Today, he was just another passenger, one of hundreds making their way toward Gate 24. He let himself fall into the routine of boarding, ticket scan, the mandatory glance at the large flight display board, and then the security checkpoint with its perfunctory nods and mechanical smiles. Harry had designed his company to be about more than just flights. It was about respect, decency, and a promise that everyone would be treated as more than just a number. And yet, complaints about service had recently surfaced. Reports had trickled in of indifferent attendance, of tension and friction in places where there should have been ease and welcome. So here he was, flying incognito, quietly hoping that any issues he found could be easily corrected. Reaching the gate, Harry scanned the crowded rows of seats. Families with children, couples, solo travelers, each carried their own story. He briefly wondered what they'd think if they knew who was in their midst, but anonymity was what he needed now. The goal was authenticity, to experience his own company as an everyday passenger, to see the reality behind the reports. As boarding began, Harry was careful to stay toward the middle of the line, watching interactions unfold between the gate agents and passengers. His ticket showed him as a first-class passenger, but without any of the VIP markers his position would typically afford him. When he approached the counter, he received a brief, somewhat disinterested look from the gate agent, who glanced down at his ticket, then gave him a short nod. "No extra requests?" she asked without looking up. "No, I'm all set," Harry replied simply, catching the hint of surprise that flickered across her face. It was fleeting, but notable. Perhaps she wasn't accustomed to many first-class passengers declining offers for assistance. When he finally boarded, stepping onto the carpeted walkway, he was greeted by one of the flight attendants. The attendant gave him a once-over, her gaze dropping to his shoes before flicking back up to his face, her professional smile not reaching her eyes. "Welcome aboard," she said, but her voice was cool, as though she couldn't quite believe he belonged in first class. Harry noted her attitude, suppressing a sigh. There was no open hostility, but he could sense an unspoken reserve, a suggestion that he didn't quite fit the unspoken profile of a first-class passenger. Moving past her, Harry found his seat in the first-class cabin. The ambiance was meant to be luxurious, calming, and distinguished, the kind of space where clients could sink back and enjoy their journey. Taking his seat, he briefly admired the leather trim and the soft, ambient lighting that he had personally signed off on years ago. But at this moment, he felt oddly like an intruder in his own creation. He couldn't help but notice the difference in how the attendants interacted with other passengers. A fellow first-class passenger, a middle-aged man in a tailored suit, received a warm greeting and a glass of champagne almost immediately. The attendant smiled broadly, chatting with him as if they were old friends. Harry, meanwhile, sat waiting for the same courtesy. When, after several minutes, no one approached him, he flagged down an attendant passing by. "Excuse me," he began politely. "Could I get a glass of water, please?" The attendant shot him a quick look, her expression a blend of surprise and mild irritation, as though he were inconveniencing her with the request. "Yes, just a moment," she replied curtly and continued down the aisle, tending to other passengers. Harry watched her go, frowning slightly but determined to remain patient. This was, after all, exactly why he was here. To observe, to understand the service his airline was offering to those without titles, without authority. Finally, a different attendant arrived with his glass of water, placing it in front of him without a word before turning away. Harry took a sip, noting the contrast between the service he received and the service the other passengers seemed to enjoy. He couldn't shake the sense that his presence was somehow a disruption, that his very being in this space was seen as an inconvenience. Settling into his seat, Harry let his gaze wander around the cabin. A well-dressed elderly woman nearby caught his eye, nodding at him with a polite smile. Harry returned the gesture, grateful for the simple kindness. At least some passengers were capable of looking beyond appearances, he mused. As the plane taxied and took off, he reflected on the earlier interactions. He thought back to the days when he first founded his airline, the values he had instilled in the company's culture: respect, empathy, professionalism. It troubled him deeply to feel like a stranger in his own creation, witnessing a lack of the very qualities he had built his business on. By now, he was aware that his experiment was exposing a harsh truth. His team's behavior in his absence was less than exemplary. The contrast was stark and disheartening. He had expected to find minor issues, things that could be easily corrected through training and feedback. But what he was witnessing went beyond that. This was a fundamental issue of culture and attitude, a pervasive disregard for the values he held dear. The flight settled into a routine, and Harry continued to observe, silently taking notes in his mind. He watched as other passengers were served attentively, offered beverages and snacks, while he was left largely unnoticed. When he asked a passing flight attendant for assistance with his luggage, he received another dismissive response, almost as though his request were an imposition. Leaning back in his seat, he closed his eyes briefly, wondering how to address this when the time came. He wanted to believe that his team had simply lost sight of their training, that perhaps a reminder would be enough to bring them back to the core values of the company. But a part of him feared that the problem ran deeper, that there was an entrenched attitude within his team that would not be easily changed. As the hours passed, Harry's initial disappointment grew into a simmering frustration. It wasn't about the lack of personal attention or the dismissive looks he received. It was about the principles at stake. He had worked too hard, overcome too many obstacles to allow his company to fail the very people it was meant to serve. And if this was the reality, then he knew it was time to confront it head-on. He opened his eyes, casting a steady, assessing gaze around the cabin. The flight wasn't over yet, and neither was his investigation. As the flight settled into a predictable rhythm, Harry sat quietly in his seat, monitoring the interactions around him. The dismissive attitudes and veiled indifference of the crew hadn't gone unnoticed, and his initial disappointment had begun to harden into resolve. This wasn't a mere lapse in training. It was something deeper, an entrenched culture that eroded the values he had worked so hard to instill in his company. Harry tried to brush off the sting of his treatment, reasoning that there might be any number of explanations. Perhaps the crew was simply having a bad day, he told himself, or maybe they were overwhelmed. But the more he observed, the harder it became to ignore the pattern. Their condescension wasn't reserved just for him. It seemed to surface whenever they encountered passengers who didn't fit their idea of a first-class profile. At one point, Harry pressed the call button, seeking assistance with a minor issue regarding his seat adjustment. Several minutes passed with no response. He glanced around, watching as another passenger, a young woman seated 2 rows ahead of him, pressed her own button. Within seconds, an attendant was by her side, offering her a warm smile and helping her with an adjustment. Harry's gaze drifted down to his own call button, still lit, still ignored. When he finally managed to get the attention of a passing flight attendant, he politely requested a glass of water. The woman's face contorted briefly into a scowl before she gave a brisk nod. "Just a moment," she said, her tone clipped and cold. The water didn't arrive for another 15 minutes. Each of these minor slights was easy enough to overlook on its own, but together they painted a picture that was difficult to ignore. Harry was no stranger to the undercurrents of bias, to the ways that people could, consciously or unconsciously, reveal their prejudices. He had spent a lifetime facing down similar moments, choosing when to respond and when to let things slide. But this felt different. This wasn't a moment. It was a systemic issue, infecting a team that was supposed to represent his company. A particularly telling moment came when one of the attendants brushed by him, casting a sidelong glance that he could only describe as disdainful. She paused just long enough to mutter under her breath, loud enough for Harry to catch, "Guess anyone can sit in first class these days." The words hit him like a slap. He had dealt with racism and prejudice throughout his life, but to experience it here, within the confines of his own business, was a different kind of betrayal. He took a deep breath, reminding himself that reacting emotionally wouldn't solve anything. This was exactly why he had chosen to conduct this experiment, to see the unfiltered reality, and to confront whatever issues arose. As the flight continued, the interactions around him seemed to amplify his sense of alienation. The attendants moved efficiently through the aisles, catering to passengers who fit their unspoken criteria of desirable. The polished businessman across from him received attentive service, each of his requests met with cheerful compliance. The couple nearby, dressed in expensive designer clothes, were doted upon with almost excessive enthusiasm. Meanwhile, Harry's attempts to engage with the staff were met with terse responses or outright disregard. His request for a blanket was met with a pointed look, as though he were somehow asking too much. When he asked for assistance with adjusting his seat, the attendant rolled her eyes, muttering under her breath before reluctantly offering a half-hearted apology. Seated next to Harry was an older woman with kind eyes who had observed much of the interaction. After one particularly dismissive exchange, she leaned toward him, her voice low. "I couldn't help but notice. They're not treating you very well, are they?" she asked, her tone sympathetic. Harry managed a thin smile, shrugging slightly. "I suppose they have certain expectations," he replied, choosing his words carefully. The woman nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I've seen it before," she said. "People get comfortable, start making assumptions. I'm sorry you're having to deal with it." Her words lingered with Harry, a reminder that these biases weren't just figments of his imagination. They were real, and they were noticed by others. It was a bitter confirmation of what he had already suspected. This wasn't a one-off incident, but a pattern of behavior, deeply embedded in the culture of his crew. Determined to remain calm, Harry leaned back in his seat, his mind racing as he considered his next move. He couldn't ignore what was happening, but he also knew that confronting the crew directly would be futile. He needed to see this through to the end, to gather as much insight as possible before making any decisions. Inwardly, he grappled with memories of his own journey. As a young man, he had faced countless obstacles, encountering prejudice and discrimination at nearly every turn. He had fought hard to build his business, striving to create a company that would stand as a beacon of equality and respect. That his own employees could betray those principles so blatantly was a bitter pill to swallow. The flight continued, and with each passing interaction, Harry's disappointment deepened. His company was meant to represent something more than just profit. It was a statement of integrity, a place where people from all walks of life could feel valued and respected. But here, in the very heart of his enterprise, those values had been twisted and eroded. At one point, Harry watched as an attendant offered a glass of champagne to the businessman seated across the aisle. She smiled warmly, engaging him in friendly conversation, her body language open and relaxed. When she noticed Harry observing, her smile faded and her gaze turned icy. She moved on without so much as acknowledging his presence. Harry's mind began to race with possible solutions. He knew that a mere reprimand wouldn't be enough to address what he was witnessing. This required a fundamental shift in culture, a re-education of his team on the values that his company stood for. He considered the prospect of implementing new training programs, perhaps even reshaping the hiring process to ensure that every member of his crew understood the importance of empathy and respect. Lost in thought, he barely noticed when the plane hit a patch of turbulence, jolting him back to the present. The passengers around him murmured nervously, but Harry remained still, his gaze fixed on the indifferent faces of the crew as they continued with their duties. He was shaken, not by the turbulence, but by the realization that his own company, the symbol of his life's work and his dedication to equality, had become a place where people were judged not by their humanity, but by their appearances and perceived worth. As the flight neared its midpoint, Harry found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. He remembered the early days of his career, the long nights and the endless meetings, the battles fought and won against those who doubted him because of his background. He had believed that his success would insulate him from the prejudices he had faced growing up. Yet, here he was, in his own first-class seat, treated as an outsider in his own company. He clenched his hands, the frustration and disappointment building within him like a storm. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. He had created this airline to break down barriers, to offer people a space where they could feel safe and valued. And now, here he was, watching as his own employees dismissed him without a second thought. Toward the end of the flight, one of the attendants passed by him, barely glancing in his direction. He seized the opportunity to ask her for a glass of water, hoping that perhaps, by some miracle, she would respond with the courtesy he had once expected from his staff. Instead, she rolled her eyes, her expression one of barely concealed irritation. "I'll get to it when I have a chance," she muttered before walking away. Harry took a deep breath, fighting to keep his composure. This was no longer just about a poor experience. It was about the core of who he was, about the principles he had built his company on. And as he sat there, waiting for the drink that would never come, he made a silent vow. This behavior would not go unaddressed. These people, who wore the uniform of his airline, who represented his name and his values, would come to understand the full weight of their actions. As the flight continued, Harry tried to maintain his composure. He reminded himself that his purpose here was to observe, to understand the issues within his company without bias. But every interaction, every slight he faced, made that goal harder to uphold. His patience was wearing thin, and his disappointment had deepened into frustration. The very people he had entrusted with his vision were systematically eroding it before his eyes. The attendants were moving through the cabin, distributing drinks and snacks. As they approached Harry, he prepared to ask for a simple item, a pillow to make his seat more comfortable. The attendant looked over him, pausing as though deciding whether to fulfill his request. When he finally caught her attention, he gestured politely. "Excuse me, could I get a pillow, please?" She glanced at him, her eyes narrowing slightly. Without a word, she reached over to the storage compartment and retrieved a pillow, handing it to him with a barely disguised look of irritation. "There you go," she muttered, her tone icy as if the request had somehow offended her. Harry took the pillow, murmuring his thanks, but inside his anger simmered. It was clear now that this was no mere oversight. The attendants were actively dismissive, and their disdain was palpable. He could feel their condescension, their unspoken belief that he didn't belong in first class, and it was an insult he could no longer ignore. As he adjusted the pillow behind him, the man seated across the aisle turned to glance at him, his eyebrows raised in silent acknowledgement. Harry could sense the sympathy in the man's gaze, a tacit understanding between them. It was a small comfort, knowing that someone else saw what he was experiencing. Then, just as Harry was about to settle in, one of the younger flight attendants walked down the aisle, stopping near his seat. She carried a tray of drinks, her expression casual, but her gaze subtly calculating. Harry noticed her, watching him, a look of mild disdain flickering across her face before she addressed him. "Oh, are you sure you don't want a parachute?" she asked, her voice dripping with sarcasm. She held up a cocktail napkin in a mocking gesture, pretending it was a parachute strap. "In case, first class isn't up to your standards?" Her smirk widened as she looked at him, clearly enjoying her own joke. Harry's face remained impassive, but inside, something broke. This wasn't just rude behavior or poor service. This was outright provocation, an attempt to humiliate him in front of the other passengers. The attendant's tone held an edge, a sense of smug superiority that made her words sting all the more. The nearby passengers, who had already noticed the tension, now looked on with a mix of shock and disapproval. A few exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of confusion and discomfort. Harry caught the eye of the elderly woman seated beside him, who looked horrified by the interaction. She shook her head slightly as if to convey her empathy. Harry took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. He wouldn't allow himself to be drawn into an open conflict here, not yet. Instead, he met the attendant's gaze evenly, letting her see that her attempt to rattle him had failed. "I think I'll manage just fine, thank you," he replied in a calm, measured tone, keeping his voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. The attendant's smirk faltered, but she quickly recovered, rolling her eyes before turning away with an exaggerated sigh, as though his response had been beneath her. Harry watched her walk away, her posture radiating indifference. It was a slap in the face, a blatant display of disregard for not only him as a passenger, but also for the values he had built his company on. The elderly woman beside him reached over, placing a comforting hand on his arm. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice full of empathy. "That was completely uncalled for. You shouldn't have to put up with this." Harry offered her a tight smile, grateful for her kindness. But the situation had escalated beyond mere inconvenience. It had become personal, a direct challenge to his dignity and authority. One of the other passengers, a middle-aged man a few rows back, called out to the attendant. "Hey, that was way out of line," he said, his voice firm. "You don't talk to passengers like that." The attendant looked taken aback, clearly unprepared for the backlash. She shot the man a glare, her expression defensive. "It was just a joke," she muttered. "People need to lighten up." But Harry saw the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. She hadn't expected anyone to speak up, hadn't anticipated that other passengers would notice her behavior. And, as he looked around, he could see that more than a few people were watching her, their faces reflecting disapproval. The attendant's bravado began to falter, but she maintained her defensive posture, unwilling to concede. The senior flight attendant noticed the growing tension and came over, glancing between Harry and the younger attendant with a frown. "What's going on here?" she asked, her tone sharp as she addressed the younger woman. The younger attendant crossed her arms, shrugging dismissively. "Nothing, just he was being difficult," she muttered, nodding in Harry's direction. The senior attendant turned to Harry, her expression polite but impersonal. "Is there a problem, sir?" Harry met her gaze, feeling the weight of his disappointment crystallize into resolve. He was done tolerating their disrespect, done enduring their snide remarks and thinly veiled hostility. He had tried to be patient, to observe without judgment, but they had crossed the line. "Yes, there is," he replied calmly, his voice steady. "Your team's behavior has been unprofessional from the start. I've been ignored, dismissed, and insulted, and it's clear that your crew believes I don't belong here. I've spent the flight observing, hoping it was just a misunderstanding, but it's not. This is a pattern, and it's unacceptable." His words hung in the air, and the senior attendant's face paled slightly. She glanced around, noticing the other passengers watching, their expressions expectant. There was no easy way for her to deflect his accusation, not with so many witnesses. I apologize if there's been any misunderstanding," she stammered, trying to maintain her composure. "We didn't mean to offend you, sir." Harry inclined his head, accepting her apology with the barest nod. "I'm sure that's what you'd like me to believe, but I can assure you that this experience has been far from what I would expect from any airline, least of all my own." The senior attendant blinked, her mouth opening slightly as realization dawned on her face. "Your own?" she echoed, her voice faltering. Harry looked her squarely in the eyes, allowing the weight of his words to sink in. "Yes," he said, his tone firm and unwavering. "My name is Harry Davis. I'm the owner of this airline, and I expect my employees to uphold the standards of respect and professionalism that I built this company on. Clearly, those standards have been forgotten." The silence that followed was almost tangible, a stunned stillness that spread through the cabin as his words registered. The senior attendant's face went pale, her bravado crumbling as she processed the implications. The younger attendant's expression shifted from defiance to horror, her eyes widening as she realized the gravity of her actions. The other passengers murmured in hushed tones, a mixture of shock and admiration evident in their voices. Some of them glanced at Harry with newfound respect, while others looked at the attendants with barely concealed disapproval. The senior attendant stammered, struggling to find her voice. "Mr. Davis, I didn't know. I had no idea." Harry held up a hand, silencing her. "That's the problem. You didn't know and you didn't care. You treated me, and likely others, as though we didn't matter. And that's a failure on every level, both yours and mine. But rest assured, it's a failure I intend to address." He turned his gaze to the younger attendant, who had turned ashen, her earlier bravado shattered. She looked down, unable to meet his eyes. "I will be filing a formal report on this incident," he continued, his tone cold, "and I can assure you that this behavior will not be tolerated, not in my company." The attendants exchanged horrified glances, their composure unraveling as they realized the consequences of their actions. Harry could see the fear and regret in their faces, but his own expression remained impassive. He felt no sympathy for them. They had made their choices, and now they would face the consequences. The flight continued in near silence, the atmosphere tense and charged. Harry sat back in his seat, his disappointment tempered by a sense of resolve. He had come here to uncover the truth, and now that he had, he would do whatever it took to ensure that his company upheld the values he had fought so hard to establish. As the plane began its descent, Harry's gaze remained fixed ahead, his mind already turning to the steps he would take to restore integrity within his organization. There would be repercussions, changes, and hard conversations, but he was prepared to face them. This was his company, his vision, and he would not allow it to be tarnished by those who failed to see beyond their own prejudice. As the plane began its descent, a heavy silence filled the cabin, punctuated only by the occasional clink of glassware and the low murmur of engines. Harry remained seated, his gaze steely and his expression unreadable. The attendants had retreated to the back of the cabin, their faces pale, their movements subdued. They avoided his eyes, knowing that their careless actions had brought them to this uncomfortable reckoning. When the plane touched down, Harry was among the first to rise, his movements calm yet purposeful. He turned to address the passengers, whose expressions ranged from curiosity to sympathy. The events of the flight had not gone unnoticed, and he could see that many of them were now piecing together what had transpired. Some had already recognized his name, while others simply looked on, captivated by the unfolding drama. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice resonant and clear, "I appreciate your patience and understanding during this flight. I am Harry Davis, owner of this airline, and I feel it's only right to address what some of you may have witnessed here today." The murmuring stopped and the passengers turned their full attention to him. Harry took a steadying breath, choosing his words carefully. An airline is more than just a mode of transport. It's an experience, one that should embody respect, courtesy, and dignity for everyone on board. When I started this company, it was with a vision of creating a place where all passengers, regardless of background, would feel valued and welcomed. Unfortunately, today I have seen firsthand that this vision has not been upheld. He glanced toward the back of the cabin where the attendants stood, their faces a mixture of fear and regret. They looked away, some of them staring at the floor, unable to meet his gaze. The behavior I encountered on this flight, the disregard, the condescension, and the outright hostility, is not what this airline stands for, he continued, his voice unwavering. It is unacceptable and unprofessional, and it goes against everything I have worked to build. A wave of murmurs swept through the cabin, and he could see nods of agreement from the passengers. The elderly woman who had spoken to him earlier offered him an encouraging smile, her eyes warm with admiration. Harry felt a surge of gratitude for her support, but he also knew that the time for kindness had passed. He needed to make it clear that there would be consequences. Turning back to the attendants, he fixed them with a steely gaze. "I expect my employees to uphold the values of this airline, values that include treating every passenger with respect and dignity," he said, his tone firm. "Today, I saw a failure of those values, a failure that I intend to address immediately. As of this moment, I am placing every member of this cabin crew on probation, pending a full investigation. There will be consequences for the behavior I witnessed here today." The attendants' faces turned even paler, and one of them opened her mouth as if to protest, but no words came. She closed it again, her expression stricken. Harry didn't look away, holding them accountable with a gaze that conveyed both authority and disappointment. Furthermore, he continued, I will be implementing mandatory training for all employees in customer service, sensitivity, and professionalism. This incident has revealed serious flaws in our operations, flaws that will be corrected to ensure that every passenger experiences the respect they deserve. He paused, letting his words sink in. The passengers around him were silent, their expressions a mixture of respect and appreciation. Harry knew that the decisions he was making were necessary, not only for the reputation of his airline, but for the integrity of his vision. As he finished, one of the other passengers, a middle-aged man in a business suit, raised his hand. Mr. Davis, he said, his voice carrying a note of admiration, I just wanted to say thank you. It's not often you see an executive take responsibility like this. I think I speak for everyone here when I say that your actions are commendable. The cabin filled with a gentle murmur of agreement, and Harry inclined his head, acknowledging the man's words with a nod. Thank you, he replied. I believe that every business has a duty to its customers, a duty that extends beyond profits and policies. It's about people, about respect, and I promise you that commitment will only grow stronger from here. With that, he turned back to the attendants who now looked visibly shaken. He gave them a final, steady look before addressing the senior flight attendant directly. Upon our arrival, I expect each of you to file a report on your conduct during this flight. You will meet with our HR department and participate in a thorough review of our customer service policies. Consider this an opportunity to reflect on your actions and to understand the standards this airline upholds. The senior flight attendant nodded, her expression tight. Yes, Mr. Davis, she murmured, her voice barely audible. Harry inclined his head. Good. I'll expect nothing less. With the matter addressed, he turned to exit the plane, pausing only to acknowledge the passengers who offered him encouraging smiles and nods. He felt a sense of both relief and resolve. He had confronted the issue head-on, and while the situation had been far from ideal, he knew that he had done what was necessary to protect the integrity of his company. As he stepped onto the jet bridge, he took a deep breath, inhaling the cool, fresh air. It was a stark contrast to the stifling atmosphere he had just left behind. For a moment, he allowed himself to reflect on the journey that had brought him here, on the values that had driven him to create this airline, and on the changes that he knew were now inevitable. He was met by one of the ground crew members who escorted him to a private lounge. There, he was greeted by his executive assistant, who had been alerted to the situation. Mr. Davis, she said, her voice filled with concern, we've prepared a conference room for you, and we're ready to proceed with any actions you deem necessary. Harry nodded, grateful for her efficiency. Thank you. Please arrange for a meeting with our HR director and contact the training department. We'll need to organize sensitivity and customer service workshops as soon as possible. Understood, she replied, taking notes on her tablet. Would you like to issue a statement to the public as well? He considered it, recognizing the importance of transparency. Yes, he replied after a moment's thought. Draft a statement acknowledging the incident, emphasizing our commitment to respect and professionalism, and outline the steps we're taking to address the issue. I want it released as soon as possible. The assistant nodded, her fingers flying over the tablet as she noted down his instructions. Harry watched her work, his mind racing with plans for the changes that would soon be implemented. As he waited for the conference room to be prepared, he took a seat, allowing himself a moment of quiet reflection. The events of the flight had been a stark reminder of the work that still needed to be done. He had believed that his company embodied his values, but today's experience had shown him that there were still gaps, still flaws that required his attention. The door opened, and a team of executives entered, each wearing expressions of concern and attentiveness. They had been briefed on the situation, and Harry could see that they were eager to discuss the steps forward. "Mr. Davis," one of them began, "we're deeply sorry for what happened on that flight. This incident does not reflect the values of our company, and we're committed to making things right." Harry nodded, appreciating their support. "I understand, and I appreciate your dedication, but this goes beyond just one incident. We need to ensure that this never happens again, and that starts with a commitment to change at every level of the organization." He outlined his plan, emphasizing the importance of empathy, respect, and accountability. His executives listened intently, nodding in agreement as he spoke. "We'll begin with mandatory training for all employees," he said, "but we'll also conduct a thorough review of our hiring and onboarding processes. We need to be certain that every person who wears our uniform understands what it means to represent this airline and the values we stand for." His executives took notes, their faces determined. They understood that this was more than just a corrective action. It was a fundamental shift in the company's culture. "Furthermore," Harry continued, "I want to establish an anonymous reporting system. Employees and passengers alike should feel empowered to report any instances of disrespect or misconduct without fear of retribution. This airline will be a place where people feel safe, valued, and respected." The executives nodded in agreement, each of them recognizing the importance of these changes. Harry felt a sense of satisfaction, knowing that he was taking concrete steps to prevent future incidents. As the meeting came to a close, one of the executives turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "Mr. Davis," she said, "your commitment to integrity is truly inspiring. I think everyone here can agree that we're proud to work for a company that values its principles so deeply." Harry inclined his head, his gaze steady. "Thank you. This is not just a business. It's a reflection of who we are, of what we believe in, and we will do whatever it takes to ensure that our values are upheld." With the meeting adjourned, Harry returned to his office, his mind already racing with plans for the future. He knew that the changes he was implementing would take time, that there would be challenges along the way, but he was ready to face them, determined to protect the integrity of the company he had built. This incident had been a wake-up call, a reminder that his work was far from over, but he was grateful for the opportunity it had given him, the chance to reaffirm his commitment to the values that mattered most. And as he looked out over the city skyline, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was his legacy, his contribution to the world, and he would fight to protect it, to ensure that it remained a place of respect, dignity, and integrity for all who chose to fly with him. Harry's office was filled with the quiet hum of activity as his team worked to implement the changes he had mandated. The incident on the plane had lit a fire under him, propelling him to action with an urgency that left no room for delay. He was determined to address the systemic issues he had witnessed, to ensure that the values he held so dear were woven into the very fabric of his airline. After hours of planning, calls, and discussions, Harry finally stood in front of a large team assembled in the conference hall, made up of executives, senior management, HR leaders, and customer service trainers. It was an important gathering, one that would set the tone for the reforms he was about to announce. "Thank you all for being here," Harry began, his voice firm and steady. "I know the last few days have been intense. I want to make it clear that this is not simply a reaction to an isolated incident. This is a call to redefine our culture, to restore the principles upon which this company was built." He scanned the room, meeting the gaze of each person with a mixture of resolve and expectation. The behaviors I witnessed on that flight were not only disappointing, but a fundamental betrayal of what this airline represents, and I refuse to let my company become a place where anyone is made to feel less than they are. We are here to set a new standard, a standard of respect, of dignity, and of empathy. The attendees listened intently, some nodding in agreement, others with thoughtful expressions as they absorbed the weight of his words. Harry continued, outlining the new training programs, accountability measures, and anonymous reporting system that would soon be implemented. "Every member of our team will undergo comprehensive customer service training," he explained. "This will not be a one-time event, but an ongoing process. Sensitivity training, respect for diversity, and the basics of professional courtesy will be our foundation. We'll make sure that every employee knows what we stand for and what we will not tolerate." He turned to the head of the HR department. "I also want detailed background checks and an expanded hiring process to ensure we're bringing in people who embody our values from day one. The next wave of recruitment should reflect the inclusivity we promise our customers." The head of HR nodded, taking careful notes as Harry spoke. Finally, he addressed the matter of the anonymous reporting system. "This tool will give both passengers and employees a way to voice concerns without fear of retaliation. If there's even a hint of misconduct, we'll investigate and respond appropriately. This is non-negotiable." With the new policies laid out, Harry opened the floor for questions. A young woman from the customer service team raised her hand. "Mr. Davis, I think these changes are inspiring," she began. "But how do we make sure these values aren't just words on paper? How do we make sure every employee actually believes in them?" Harry nodded, appreciating the depth of her question. "Excellent point. It's one thing to mandate change and another to cultivate it. That's why I'll be leading by example. I'll be spending more time with our teams on the ground, in training sessions and on flights. You all are encouraged to do the same. Our actions must reflect our principles." A murmur of agreement spread through the room, and Harry sensed a renewed energy in the team. He knew that the path ahead would not be easy. The change on this scale would require commitment, patience, and perseverance. But he was ready to put in the work, to lead his company through the transformation it so desperately needed. With the meeting concluded, Harry returned to his office, where he was greeted by his executive assistant with an update. "Mr. Davis, the public response to your statement has been overwhelmingly positive," she informed him, a hint of excitement in her voice. "We've received hundreds of messages from customers who are grateful for your transparency and commitment to change. Some of them even shared their own stories of discrimination they faced in other settings, thanking you for taking a stand." Harry allowed himself a small smile. He was glad to see that people were recognizing his intentions. This wasn't just about addressing a single incident. It was about reshaping an industry and challenging the norms that allowed prejudice to go unchecked. The assistant hesitated before continuing. "There's one more thing, sir. The flight attendants from your recent trip, and they've been waiting outside, hoping to speak with you." Harry raised an eyebrow, surprised by the news. He hadn't expected to see them again so soon, but he supposed it was inevitable. He took a moment to steady himself, knowing that this conversation would be difficult, yet necessary. "Send them in," he said, his voice calm but firm. A few moments later, the flight attendants entered his office, their expressions a mix of apprehension and remorse. They stood before him, a unified front, yet Harry could see the guilt etched on their faces. The memory of their behavior on the flight flashed through his mind, and he felt a surge of anger that he quickly pushed aside. This was a moment for resolution, not resentment. The senior flight attendant, who had been the first to speak to him that day, took a hesitant step forward. "Mr. Davis," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, we wanted to apologize. We acted unprofessionally, and we didn't treat you, or anyone else, with the respect you deserve. There's no excuse for what we did." The others nodded, each of them wearing expressions of genuine remorse. Harry listened in silence, allowing them to speak, to confront the weight of their actions. "We know we failed you, sir," the younger attendant added, her voice trembling. "We took for granted the responsibility we have as representatives of your company. We're truly sorry, and we're prepared to accept whatever consequences you deem necessary." Harry regarded them thoughtfully, taking in their words, their sincerity. He saw that they were truly regretful, that they had come to understand the gravity of their behavior, but regret alone was not enough. "I appreciate your apology," he replied, his tone steady but unyielding. "But apologies don't undo the harm that was caused. They don't erase the disrespect you showed, not only to me, but to every passenger who witnessed it." The attendants looked down, their expression somber. "That said," Harry continued, "I believe in second chances. I believe that people can learn, can grow, if they're willing to put in the effort. And so, I'm giving you a choice. You can either resign from your positions, or you can commit to the training and reforms we're implementing. This won't be a simple process. It will require dedication, humility, and a willingness to confront your own biases. If you're not ready to make that commitment, then this may not be the right place for you." The attendants exchanged glances, their faces a mixture of relief and determination. Harry could see the resolve forming in their eyes, the understanding that this was their opportunity to redeem themselves. "We're ready, sir," the senior attendant replied, her voice filled with conviction. "We want to be better. We want to uphold the values of this airline, and we're willing to do whatever it takes to prove that we're capable of change." Harry nodded, satisfied. He had given them a chance, and they had chosen to take it. It was now up to them to follow through. "Very well," he said, his tone firm yet encouraging. "You'll report to the training department tomorrow morning. From now on, I expect nothing less than your absolute best." The attendants nodded, their expressions a mixture of gratitude and resolve. As they turned to leave, Harry felt a sense of closure, a reassurance that his decision had been the right one. The following days were a whirlwind of activity as the new policies were rolled out. Harry personally attended some of the training sessions, observing as employees engaged with the material, asking questions, and challenging their own assumptions. The anonymous reporting system was set up, and employees were encouraged to use it without fear of repercussion. News of the reforms spread quickly, and Harry's airline became a symbol of change within the industry. Articles were written, interviews were conducted, and Harry found himself at the forefront of a movement he hadn't anticipated. The public response was overwhelmingly positive, and passengers flocked to his airline, eager to experience the new standards he had established. As the weeks passed, Harry felt a renewed sense of pride in his company. The changes had not been easy, but they had been worth it. He watched as his employees embraced the new culture, as passengers expressed their satisfaction and gratitude for the respectful treatment they received. One day, as he boarded a flight to attend an industry conference, Harry was greeted by a young flight attendant who smiled warmly as she handed him a glass of water. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Davis," she said, her voice genuine and kind. "It's an honor to have you with us today." Harry smiled, feeling a surge of pride as he settled into his seat. This was the airline he had envisioned, a place where every passenger felt valued, where respect was more than just a slogan, and as he looked around the cabin, he knew that he had created something truly meaningful. This was more than a business. It was a legacy, a testament to the power of integrity, and a reminder that justice and respect were worth fighting for. In the weeks following the flight, Harry's life had become a whirlwind of interviews, internal meetings, and public engagements. His decision to confront the issues within his airline had sparked a firestorm of attention, with media outlets praising his transparency and commitment to change. Headlines lauded his approach, calling him a leader for a new era of corporate integrity. But for Harry, the accolades were secondary. What mattered most was seeing the culture of his airline shift toward the values he had always championed. Sitting in his office one quiet afternoon, he reviewed the latest reports from his HR and training departments. The implementation of the new policies had gone smoothly, with employees embracing the change more openly than he had expected. Complaints had decreased, and positive feedback had surged, not just from passengers, but from staff as well. It was clear that people were responding to the new environment, feeling more valued and respected in a way that was now unmistakable. Harry's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at his door. His executive assistant stepped in, a smile on her face. "Mr. Davis, I thought you'd like to know. There's been a significant uptick in customer satisfaction ratings for the last quarter. The changes are making a real impact." Harry nodded, feeling a sense of pride. "Thank you. And what about the crew from my flight? How are they adjusting?" His assistant smiled. "They're actually doing remarkably well. They've completed their training with high marks, and several of their supervisors have commented on their improved attitudes and performance. It seems like they've really taken this opportunity to grow." Harry's face softened. He was glad to hear it. "Good. That's all I could ask for." The assistant paused, a thoughtful look crossing her face. "Mr. Davis, there's one more thing. We've received hundreds of letters from customers who wanted to thank you personally. Some of them shared stories of how your actions inspired them to confront issues in their own lives, workplaces, and communities. They say that seeing someone in your position take a stand like this, it gave them hope." Harry felt a lump form in his throat. He had acted because it was the right thing to do, but knowing that his actions had inspired others gave him a renewed sense of purpose. This was more than just a victory for his company. It was a message, a beacon of hope for those who needed to see that change was possible. "Thank you for telling me," he said quietly. "It means a lot to hear that." As his assistant left, Harry sat back in his chair reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. The incident on that flight had been painful, a reminder of the challenges he had faced throughout his life, but it had also been transformative. It had allowed him to confront not just the flaws within his company, but also the prejudices that still lingered in society. And in doing so, he had forged a new path, one that aligned more closely with his vision of equality and respect. Later that evening, Harry attended a company-wide meeting to formally address his team. Employees filled the room, their faces a mixture of curiosity, admiration, and gratitude. As he took the stage, he felt the weight of their expectations, but he also knew that he had earned their respect by staying true to his values. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice steady and warm. "The last few weeks have been a journey for all of us. I know that change isn't easy, and I know that the adjustments we've made required each of you to adapt, to reflect, and to grow. But I want you to know how proud I am of every single one of you." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Our company isn't just an airline. It's a commitment to treating each other with dignity and respect, and that commitment begins with each of you. You are the heart of this airline, and it's your dedication, your compassion, and your professionalism that make us who we are." A murmur of appreciation swept through the room, and Harry saw nods of agreement from his employees. "We've been through a difficult time, but we came through it stronger," he continued, "and I am committed to continuing this journey with you. We will keep improving, keep learning, and keep growing, because that's what it means to be part of this company. It means standing together, upholding our values, and treating each other and our customers with the respect they deserve." The room erupted into applause, and Harry felt a surge of pride. He knew that he had earned their trust not by his title, but by his actions, and as he looked out over the faces of his team, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, a commitment to leading by example and building a legacy that went beyond profit. When the applause died down, one of the senior flight attendants raised her hand. It was the same woman who had confronted him on the flight, her face now filled with gratitude and humility. "Mr. Davis," she said, her voice steady, "I just wanted to say thank you. Not just for giving us a second chance, but for showing us what it truly means to be part of this company. You could have let us go, and we would have deserved it. But instead, you gave us an opportunity to grow. And I know I speak for all of us when I say that we will work every day to live up to your expectations." Harry nodded, deeply moved by her words. "Thank you. That's all I could ask for." As the meeting concluded, Harry returned to his office, feeling a profound sense of fulfillment. He had taken a difficult path, but he knew that it had been worth it. The changes he had implemented weren't just cosmetic. They were a part of a larger shift toward a culture of respect and integrity. Later that night, as he reflected on the events that had brought him here, he felt a sense of peace. The journey had been challenging, but it had reaffirmed his purpose, reminded him of the values that mattered most. He had confronted injustice, taken a stand, and made a difference, not just within his company, but in the lives of those who looked to him as an example. And as he drifted off to sleep, he knew that this was only the beginning. The road ahead would be long, but he was ready to walk it, guided by the principles that had brought him this far. This was his legacy, his contribution to a better world, and he would continue to fight for it every day with all the strength he had. In the end, Harry knew that this journey wasn't about him. It was about something greater, something enduring. It was about the power of integrity, the importance of justice, and the simple truth that every person deserved to be treated with respect. And with that knowledge, he felt a sense of fulfillment that no title or accolade could ever match. This was his purpose, his mission, and he would pursue it with unwavering dedication for as long as he lived. Thank you for watching this story to the end. To make sure you don't miss out on more inspiring stories, subscribe to the channel and click the bell. Share this video with your friends and family. Let this story resonate in their hearts. And don't forget to watch our other videos. There's more to come.